pen scratched violently against the heavy parchment, sealing the end of a 4-year marriage in less than 3 seconds. No shouting, no shattered glass. Just the suffocating smell of ozone and bitter espresso choking the sterile boardroom. He signed the divorce papers without a tremor, walking out with nothing but a frayed trench coat and a secret buried beneath his ribs. 2 tiny, erratic heartbeats he would die before letting the alpha discover. The mahogany table in the conference room was too polished. Kieran stared at his own distorted reflection in the wood grain, watching the pale, hollowed-out version of himself blink back. The silence in the room was absolute, save for the hum of the climate control and the rhythmic, impatient tapping of a platinum Rolex against the armrest. Declan Hayes did not look like a man dismantling his life. He looked like a man closing an acquisition. Kieran kept his eyes fixed on the contract. 50 pages of dense legalese that boiled down to a simple truth. He was being discarded. Declan's scent, a sharp, overwhelming wave of frosted pine and ozone, filled the enclosed space. It used to smell like coming home. Now it felt like standing naked in a blizzard. It prickled against Kieran's skin, drawing out a defensive sour note in his own omega pheromones. He smelled of crushed chamomile turning bitter, of spoiled honey. He knew he smelled afraid, and he hated himself for it. "If we could proceed to the final signatures," Mr. Reed, Declan's attorney, said. The man's voice was a practiced monotone, polished smooth by years of orchestrating the wreckage of the ultra-rich. "Mr. Brooks, as stipulated in Section 4, the severance package includes the downtown loft and a monthly stipend of—" "I don't want the loft." Kieran's voice cracked. He cleared his throat, tasting bile, and tried again. "I don't want the loft, and I don't want the money, just the original account I had before the marriage." For the first time since they had entered the room, Declan looked up from his phone. His eyes were the color of slate roofing right before a thunderstorm. Flat, impenetrable. "Don't be a martyr, Kieran. Take the money. You don't have a degree. You haven't worked in 4 years. You'll starve." There was no malice in Declan's voice. That was the worst part. If there had been anger, Kieran could have fought back. If there had been hatred, he could have found his own rage. But there was only a clinical, detached pity. Declan was an alpha CEO who operated on efficiency. Their mating had proven inefficient, barren, and ultimately a distraction. The board had whispered. The press had speculated. An alpha of Declan's standing needed an heir, and Kieran's empty womb had become a liability on a corporate balance sheet. Kieran picked up the heavy Mont Blanc pen provided by the lawyer. The metal was cold. It felt foreign in his grip. "I'll be fine," Kieran muttered. He didn't look at Declan. If he looked, he would break. He would throw himself across the table, bare his neck, and beg. His biology screamed at him to submit, to release calming pheromones, to soothe his alpha. He gritted his teeth so hard his jaw ached, fighting the primitive, humiliating instinct. He pressed the nib to the paper. The ink bled into the fibers. Kieran Brooks, not Hayes. Brooks. He signed 3 copies. With each stroke, the phantom tether between them, the mating bite that had faded to a dull silver scar on his scent gland, throbbed with a phantom ache. "Done," Mr. Reed murmured, sweeping the papers away into a leather folio. The snap of the briefcase's closing sounded like a gunshot. Declan stood up, buttoning his suit jacket. Custom Italian wool, midnight blue. "My assistant will handle the logistics of moving your things. I've already packed," Kieran said. He stood up too fast. A wave of dizziness washed over him, blurring the edges of his vision. The room tilted. He gripped the edge of the mahogany table, his knuckles turning white. His stomach rolled violently. He swallowed hard, forcing the nausea back down his throat. "Just stress," he told himself. "It's just the stress." Declan frowned, a tiny crease appearing between his brows. He took half a step forward. "Are you—" "I'm fine," Kieran snapped, stepping back. He grabbed his coat from the back of the chair. The fabric was rough against his clammy skin. "Have a good life, Declan." He didn't wait for an answer. He turned and walked out of the glass doors, down the carpeted hallway, and into the elevator. He hit the button for the lobby. The doors slid shut, cutting off the scent of pine and ozone. Alone in the mirrored box, Kieran finally let out a breath. It shuddered out of him, ragged and wet. He leaned his forehead against the cool glass. The elevator dropped, and his stomach dropped with it. The nausea spiked again, sharp and sudden. He clamped a hand over his mouth, gagging dryly. The descent felt endless. When the doors finally chimed open on the ground floor, he practically ran across the marble lobby, ignoring the curious stares of the security guards. He burst through the revolving doors and hit the street. The city air was thick with the smell of exhaust fumes, wet concrete, and roasting nuts from a nearby vendor cart. Usually, Kieran liked the chaos of the city. Today, it assaulted his senses. Everything was too loud, too bright, too pungent. He stumbled into a narrow alley between a high-end boutique and a coffee shop, fell to his knees beside a rusted dumpster, and threw up. He retched until his ribs ached, spitting bitter, stringy saliva onto the dirty asphalt. The smell of garbage and stagnant water made him gag again, but there was nothing left in his stomach. He slumped against the damp brick wall, shivering despite the mild autumn weather. He pressed a hand to his stomach. It was flat and tight with anxiety. "You'll starve," Declan had said. Kieran wiped his mouth with the back of his trembling hand. "Watch me," he whispered to the empty alley. The apartment was above a 24-hour laundromat in a neighborhood that smelled perpetually of artificial lavender detergent and stale grease from the corner takeout joint. The rent took a terrifying chunk out of the meager savings Kieran had in his pre-marriage account. He sat on the edge of the mattress, a sagging, second-hand thing he'd bought off a guy on the internet, and stared at the peeling yellow paint on the opposite wall. The radiator in the corner clanked and hissed, spitting out tepid heat. It had been 3 weeks since the divorce. 21 days of waking up, reaching for a warmth that wasn't there. 21 days of ignoring the phantom ache in his scent gland. And 21 days of throwing up his breakfast. At first he blamed the heartbreak. The grief was a physical weight, settling in his chest like a sack of wet sand. But grief didn't make you hypersensitive to the smell of the neighbor's cheap cologne through the floorboards. Grief didn't make your breast tender, or cause your lower back to ache with a dull, persistent throb. Kieran stood up, his joints popping in the cold room. He walked to the tiny, cramped bathroom. The fluorescent light flickered, casting a sickly green pallor over his reflection in the water-spotted mirror. He looked awful. Dark circles bruised the skin under his eyes. His collarbones jutted out sharply against his oversized, faded t-shirt. He looked down at the edge of the sink. 3 plastic sticks lay in a neat, terrifying row. He had bought them from a rundown pharmacy 2 blocks away, keeping his head down, paying in crumpled bills. He had taken them all at once, just to be sure. He didn't believe the first one, or the second. All 3 bore glaring, undeniable double blue lines. Kieran traced the lines with a trembling fingertip. The plastic was cool and rigid. It felt like a sick joke. 4 years. 4 years of endless fertility treatments, temperature tracking, timed mating cycles, crying in sterile clinic bathrooms, while Declan waited outside with thinning patience. 4 years of being told his omega biology was flawed, inadequate. And now, a month after Declan cast him aside for failing to provide an heir, his body decided to work. A harsh, grating sound escaped his throat. It took him a second to realize he was laughing. It was a dark, jagged sound that bounced off the dingy tiles. He laughed until his chest burned, until the laughter cracked and dissolved into a dry, wretched sob. He sank to the linoleum floor, pulling his knees to his chest. The floor was sticky. It smelled of mildew and cheap bleach. He buried his face in his knees and let the panic wash over him. He was alone. He had less than $3,000 to his name. He was an unbonded Omega carrying an Alpha CEO's child, if Declan found out. The thought stopped his breath. Declan would take the child. He would fight for full custody, and he would win. A billionaire Alpha against a broke, unbonded Omega living above a laundromat? It wouldn't even be a contest. Declan's lawyers would destroy him. They would take his baby and lock Kieran out completely, treating him like nothing more than an incubator they had finally extracted value from. No, Kieran whispered into the empty room. He pressed his palms flat against his stomach. No. The next morning, he dragged himself to a free clinic on the edge of the city. The waiting room was packed. It smelled of unwashed bodies, cheap coffee, and fear. He sat on a hard plastic chair for 3 hours before a tired-looking nurse called his name. Dr. Miller was an older beta woman with kind eyes and a mouth pulled tight with exhaustion. She directed him to the examination table. The paper crinkled loudly under Kieran's weight as he lay back, lifting his shirt. "Let's see what we have here," she said, squeezing a glob of cold gel onto his lower abdomen. Kieran flinched. The gel was freezing. Dr. Miller pressed the transducer wand against his skin, moving it around. The black and white screen on the machine flickered to life, showing a blizzard of static. Kieran stared at the ceiling tiles, counting the water stains. He didn't want to look. If he looked, it became real. If it was real, he had to figure out how to survive it. "Well," Dr. Miller murmured, the wand pausing, "that explains the severity of your nausea, Mr. Brooks." Kieran turned his head slowly. "What?" Dr. Miller tapped the screen with a pen. "Look here. See this little sack? And right next to it, tucked a bit higher, another one." Kieran stopped breathing. The hum of the clinic around him faded into a high-pitched ring. Dr. Miller turned up a dial on the machine. A sound filled the small room, a rapid rhythmic thump, 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 thump. Then, slightly offbeat, overlapping it, a second thump, 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 thump. It sounded like horses galloping underwater. "Twins," Dr. Miller said gently. "You're about 8 weeks along. 2 strong heartbeats." Kieran stared at the 2 pulsing blurs on the monitor. 2, not 1. 2. He sat up suddenly, knocking Dr. Miller's hand away. He scrambled off the table, his bare feet hitting the cold floor. He didn't bother wiping the gel off his stomach. He just pulled his shirt down, his hand shaking so violently he could barely hold the hem. "Mr. Brooks?" "I have to go," Kieran choked out. The walls of the clinic were closing in. He needed air. He needed to run. "I'm sorry. I have to go." He bolted from the room, ignoring the nurse calling after him. He burst out the front doors into the freezing city air, gasping like a drowning man. He had a secret buried beneath his ribs, and the weight of it was suddenly so heavy he thought it might crack him in half. 5 months later, the bitter winter had settled over the city, turning the slush in the gutters to gray ice. Kieran tied the rough canvas apron around his waist, struggling to get the strings to meet behind his back. The knot rested precariously above the heavy, rounded swell of his stomach. At 28 weeks, he was enormous. His back ached with a constant dull fire, and his ankles had swollen to the point where he had to wear an old pair of slip-on sneakers 2 sizes too big. He worked the closing shift at a dusty used bookstore that doubled as a low-end cafe. The place smelled of decaying paper, roasted coffee beans, and cinnamon, a heavy, distracting scent profile that Kieran had specifically chosen to mask his own. He also relied on cheap, over-the-counter scent blockers. They came in a tiny blue bottle, cost $7, and smelled faintly of chemical lemon cleaner. They burned his skin when he applied them to his scent glands, but they dulled his sweet, milky pregnancy pheromones into something flat and unnoticeable. Kieran, can you bust the corner table?" shouted Gary, the elderly beta owner from behind the espresso machine. "On it," Kieran called back. He grabbed a plastic tub and waddled toward the back of the store. Every step sent a jolt of pain up his spine. One of the twins, he was pretty sure it was the one tucked on the left, kicked hard against his ribs. Kieran gasped softly, pausing to rub a hand over the tight fabric of his sweater. "Easy in there," he muttered under his breath. "Mama's trying to make rent." He wiped down the sticky wooden table, tossing crumpled napkins and half-empty mugs into his tub. The bell above the front door chimed, signaling a new customer. A blast of freezing air rushed into the shop, rattling the stacked paperbacks on the display tables. Kieran didn't look up immediately. He was focused on a particularly stubborn ring of dried coffee. Then it hit him. It wasn't a sound. It wasn't a sight. It was a physical impact against his senses. Frosted pine, stale ozone, the sharp biting cold of a winter storm. Kieran's breath hitched. His hand, holding the damp rag, froze mid-wipe. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up, and a deep instinctual panic flared in his chest, so intense his vision blurred at the edges. No, it's impossible. He's on the other side of the city. Kieran slowly lifted his head, peering through the maze of tall bookshelves. Standing by the front counter, brushing snow off a dark, impeccably tailored cashmere overcoat, was Declan. He looked exactly the same. Broad shoulders, sharp jawline, the same aura of untouchable authority that made the dusty bookstore look suddenly pathetic and small. He was accompanied by another man in a suit, pointing at a rare first edition display in the window. Declan was nodding, checking his watch, the same platinum Rolex. They were talking about real estate. This neighborhood was gentrifying. Declan's firm was buying up the block. Kieran's heart hammered against his ribs, beating a frantic, terrifying rhythm. Thump, 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 thump. The twins, agitated by the sudden spike of his stress hormones, and perhaps recognizing the faint echo of their sire's scent, began to roll and kick violently against his insides. Declan turned his head slightly toward the back of the shop. His brow furrowed. He inhaled, a slow, deliberate intake of breath through his nose. He caught something. Kieran dropped the rag. It hit the floor with a wet slap. He didn't wait. He abandoned the tub of dirty dishes, turned on his heel, and bolted for the employee break room in the back. Or as close to bolting as a heavily pregnant Omega could manage. He shuffled frantically behind the biography section, his chest heaving, ignoring the stabbing pain in his pelvis. He reached the back room, slipped inside, and shut the door silently behind him. The room was tiny, filled with boxes of unsorted books and the smell of stale bleach. Kieran pressed his back against the door, clapping both hands over his mouth to muffle the sound of his ragged breathing. Through the thin wood, he could hear footsteps, heavy, deliberate, the sharp click of expensive leather shoes on the hardwood floor. The footsteps stopped near the corner table Kieran had just been cleaning. "Sir?" The other man's voice drifted through the store. "Is everything all right?" There was a long silence. The scent of pine and ozone seeped under the crack of the break room door, thick and suffocating. It washed over Kieran, making his knees tremble. His Omega biology, suppressed and battered by months of hardship, flared with a sudden, traitorous urge to cry out, to demand the Alpha's attention, to show him the heavily burdened belly and seek protection. Kieran bit down on the side of his hand until he tasted blood, forcing himself to stay completely silent. The harsh, chemical smell of the lemon scent blocker on his neck felt woefully inadequate. "I thought..." Declan's voice was lower, rougher than usual. It sent a shiver down Kieran's spine. "It's nothing. Just a ghost." The footsteps turned away. They walked back to the front of the store. The bell above the door chimed again. Kieran didn't move. He stood there for a full 10 minutes, his legs shaking so badly he eventually slid down the door until he was sitting on the cold floor, his arms wrapped protectively around his stomach. He was crying, silent, bitter tears that tracked through the dust on his cheeks. He had survived today. But the ghost of his past was hunting on his territory, and Kieran knew with terrible certainty that he couldn't hide forever. The city suddenly felt much too small. Part 4. The Closing Walls. The eviction notice was taped to the inside of the bookstore's glass door. It was a bright, obnoxious neon green that clashed violently with the faded spines of the paperbacks in the window display. Kieran stood on the sidewalk, the freezing January wind cutting through the thin, patched wool of his coat. He stared at the legal jargon printed in crisp, black ink, Hayes Holdings. The name sat at the bottom of the page like a lead weight. "They bought the whole block," Gary mumbled, his hands buried deep in his pockets. The old beta looked smaller today, his shoulders hunched against the biting cold. "Gave us 30 days to vacate. Offered a buyout, but it barely covers the debt I owe on this place. I'm sorry, kid. I have to close up early. Can't afford your wages for the last month. Kieran didn't hear the apology. The blood rushing in his ears sounded like the subway trains roaring beneath the grate he was standing on. 30 days. No job. He was 32 weeks pregnant. He moved with the slow, cumbersome gait of a ship taking on water. His center of gravity was completely gone, his lower back screaming a constant, jagged song of pain. The twins were heavy, restless, and constantly pressing against his lungs, leaving him perpetually breathless. The cheap scent blockers he relied on were becoming less effective by the day. His body was preparing for birth, ramping up the production of slick, milky omega pheromones that smelled of bruised chamomile and warm honey. He had to apply the chemical lemon gel twice as often, leaving the skin of his neck red, peeling, and raw. "It's okay, Gary," Kieran rasped, his voice sounding like dry leaves. "I'll figure it out." He always figured it out. He had to. By the end of the week, Kieran found himself standing in the fluorescent-lit basement of a commercial cleaning agency. The manager, a burly alpha who smelled unpleasantly of stale cigars and wet dog, looked at Kieran's massive jutting stomach with blatant skepticism. "Night shift. Industrial spaces." The manager grunted, tapping a clipboard. "It's heavy lifting, buffing floors, emptying trash. You look like you're about to pop, kid." "I'm strong," Kieran lied, his jaw set. He desperately needed the cash. His savings were completely depleted. The rent for the miserable apartment above the laundromat was due in 4 days. "I won't be a liability." The manager sneered but handed over a rough gray uniform shirt that smelled faintly of ammonia. "Minimum wage. Start tonight at 11. Building 42 down in the financial district." The work was brutal. The night shift swallowed Kieran whole. At 2:00 a.m., the corporate building was a graveyard of glass and steel. Kieran dragged the heavy mop bucket across the pristine marble of the 64th floor. The water sloshed, gray and soapy. His swollen ankles throbbed with a hot electric pain that shot all the way up to his knees. The gray uniform shirt clung to his sweating back. He paused, leaning heavily against the mop handle, and closed his eyes. One of the twins kicked, a sharp, hard jab directly into his bladder. "Please," Kieran whispered, pressing a damp, gloved hand to the rigid curve of his belly. "Just let me finish this floor." The silence of the building was unnatural. No hum of computers, no chatter. Just the squeak of his cheap rubber soles on the wet marble. The air up here was filtered, scrubbed clean of the city's grime, smelling of absolutely nothing. It made Kieran feel exposed. He had forgotten to reapply the lemon blocker. He had been too tired, his hands shaking too much in the locker room. He smelled like sweat, floor cleaner, and an overwhelming, terrified Omega. He dipped the mop into the bucket, wringing it out with a rusted crank. He didn't hear the elevator chime. The sound was swallowed by the heavy splash of the dirty water. He didn't hear the footsteps until they were 10 yards away. Part 5. The Collision. "What the hell is going on here?" The voice cracked through the empty floor like a whip. Kieran froze. The mop slipped from his trembling hands, the wooden handle clattering loudly against the marble floor. The sound echoed, sharp and violent. He knew that voice. It lived in his nightmares. It had whispered in his ear in the dark. It had coldly dismissed him in a boardroom. Slowly, agonizingly, Kieran turned his head. Declan stood near the frosted glass doors of the executive suite. He was not in his usual immaculately tailored suit. He wore dark slacks and a black dress shirt with the sleeves rolled up, revealing the heavy silver watch on his wrist. He looked exhausted, shadows pooled beneath his slate-gray eyes, holding a stack of architectural blueprints. For a fraction of a second, Declan didn't recognize him. He just saw a pregnant, exhausted cleaner making a mess of his newly acquired office space. Then the air conditioning kicked in, pushing the air down the long corridor. Declan's head snapped up. The blueprint slipped from his grip, scattering across the wet floor in a chaotic slide of white and blue paper. His nostrils flared. The sharp, overwhelming scent of frosted pine and ozone exploded into the sterile air, so potent and immediate that Kieran physically stumbled back, hitting the edge of the mop bucket. Dirty water splashed up, soaking the cuffs of his trousers. "Kieran?" Declan's voice was barely a breath. It lacked all the polished composure of the CEO. It was rough, jagged. Kieran couldn't speak. His throat closed up. His instincts, long suppressed and battered, screamed at him to submit, to bare his neck, to seek the safety of the Alpha's massive presence. The scent of pine wrapped around him, momentarily soothing the relentless ache in his back. It was a vicious, biological betrayal. He took another step back, his wet shoe slipping on the marble. He hit the wall, his hands instinctively flying to cover his massive stomach. Declan closed the distance between them in 3 long strides. He didn't look at Kieran's face. His eyes were locked, entirely and terrifyingly, on the swell of Kieran's body beneath the rough gray uniform. "What is this?" Declan demanded, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl that vibrated in Kieran's chest. "What have you done?" "Stay away from me," Kieran choked out. He tried to push past, but Declan's hand shot out, wrapping around his wrist. The grip was like an iron vice. It wasn't gentle. It was possessive. "Let me go," Kieran thrashed, panic overriding his exhaustion. He brought his free hand up, shoving hard against Declan's chest. It was like shoving a brick wall. "You don't own me anymore. We're divorced." Declan didn't even flinch. He used his grip on Kieran's wrist to yank the Omega forward, slamming Kieran's back against his chest. The impact knocked the wind out of Kieran. Declan's free hand immediately spanned Kieran's stomach, his large palm pressing firmly against the tight, strained muscles. Right at that second, the twins moved. A heavy, rolling kick met Declan's palm. Declan went utterly rigid. The breath hissed outward through his teeth. "2," he breathed, the realization dawning with horrific clarity. "There are 2 of them. They aren't yours." Kieran lied. It was a stupid, desperate lie. "Let me go, Declan, please." "Don't insult my intelligence," Declan snarled, spinning Kieran around to face him, pinning him against the wall. The scent of ozone turned bitter, heavy with rage and adrenaline. "You signed those papers knowing. You took my heirs and hid them in a slum. You've been scrubbing floors while carrying my blood." "You threw me away!" Kieran screamed, the tears finally breaking loose, hot and stinging against his cold cheeks. "You called me a liability. You wanted a divorce. You don't get to care now." "I am an alpha," Declan said, his face inches from Kieran's. The slate eyes were entirely dilated, completely consumed by primal territorial fury. "You are carrying my pups. Did you really think I would let you keep them in the gutter?" He didn't wait for an answer. Declan reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and hit a speed dial. "Harrison!" Declan barked into the receiver, his eyes never leaving Kieran's terrified face. "Bring the car to the loading dock of Building 42. Now, cancel my morning meetings. Call Dr. Evans and have him set up a medical suite at the penthouse." "No," Kieran sobbed, trying to pry Declan's hand off his hip. "No, Declan, please. I have an apartment. I have a life." "You have nothing," Declan interrupted smoothly, slipping his phone away. His tone had returned to that terrifying, clinical calm. He reached up, his thumb wiping a tear from Kieran's cheek with a chilling mock tenderness. "But you are going to give me my children, and until they are born, you belong to me." Declan swept Kieran off his feet. Kieran cried out, striking Declan's shoulders, but the Alpha simply tightened his grip, carrying the thrashing, sobbing Omega toward the private elevator, leaving the spilled mop bucket and ruined blueprints behind on the wet marble. Part 6. The Gilded Cage. The penthouse smelled of money, cedarwood, and the suffocating lack of oxygen. Kieran sat on the edge of a massive king-sized bed in a guest room that was larger than his entire previous apartment. The mattress was memory foam, covered in Egyptian cotton sheets that felt like spun silk. He hated it. He hated the softness. It felt like quicksand. It had been 4 days since the building. 4 days of being locked inside 80 floors above the city. The first day had been a blur of forced medical examinations. Dr. Evans, an elite beta obstetrician who looked at Kieran with thinly veiled disdain, had drawn blood, performed a high-definition ultrasound, and hooked Kieran up to a dozen monitors. Declan had stood in the corner the entire time, arms crossed, asking sharp, rapid-fire questions about fetal weight, nutrition deficits, and stress levels. He never once asked how Kieran felt. He spoke about the twins as if they were fragile, high-value assets requiring a risk assessment. "He is malnourished," the doctor had said, packing up his equipment. "His cortisol levels are dangerously high. If he continues to experience this level of stress, premature labor is imminent. He needs bed rest, a strict caloric intake, and constant alpha pheromone exposure to stabilize the pregnancy." And so, the cage door had slammed shut. Kieran looked at the heavy oak door of the bedroom. It wasn't locked. Declan wasn't that crude, but the implication was clear. There was a private security guard stationed at the elevator bank. Kieran's phone had been taken. His pathetic, frayed clothes had been thrown in the incinerator, replaced by a wardrobe of ridiculously expensive soft cashmere loungewear that smelled strongly of Declan's pine and ozone. That was the cruelest torture. The scent. Kieran's rational mind despised Declan. He despised the coldness, the entitlement, the way his life had been hijacked. But his pregnant, battered omega biology was betraying him. Being steeped in his alpha's scent had an immediate narcotic effect on his body. The relentless pain in his lower back had dulled to an ache. The twins, previously frantic and kicking, had settled into a heavy, contented rhythm. He was sleeping through the night for the first time in months. His body felt safe, even as his mind screamed in panic. The door handle clicked. Kieran tensed, drawing his knees up defensively, an awkward maneuver given the massive weight of his stomach. Declan stepped into the room. He was holding a silver tray, a bowl of steaming, rich stew, a glass of fortified milk, and a small cup of prenatal vitamins. He set the tray down on the nightstand with a soft clink. "Eat," Declan commanded. It wasn't a request. Kieran glared at him, refusing to move. "I'm not hungry. Dr. Evans said you've lost weight you couldn't afford to lose. You will eat, Kieran." Declan pulled a chair from the corner and sat down, his posture rigid. "I will sit here until you do." "Are you going to force feed me?" Kieran asked bitterly. Declan's jaw clenched. A muscle ticked beneath the skin of his cheek. "Do not push me. You stole 4 months of their development from me. You endangered them. Every bite you take is a down payment on the debt you owe me." Kieran laughed, a hollow, breathless sound. "Debt? Of course. It always comes back to a ledger with you. I'm just an incubator now, right? You get your heirs, and then what? You throw me back out in the snow?" Declan leaned forward. The sheer physical presence of him was overwhelming. "You think I would let the mother of my children live in poverty? You will remain here. You will be provided for. You will want for nothing, except my freedom." Kieran spat, grabbing the glass of milk. His hand shook as he brought it to his lips. He drank it just to have something to do besides look into Declan's terrifying, empty eyes. "Freedom is an illusion for people who can't afford security," Declan replied smoothly. "You have security now." "I hate you," Kieran whispered, lowering the glass. The words tasted like ash. Declan stared at him for a long moment. He reached out, his long fingers lightly brushing the swell of Kieran's stomach through the cashmere sweater. Kieran flinched, but Declan didn't pull away. He just rested his hand there, claiming ownership. "Hate me all you want," Declan murmured, his voice dropping into a dark, rumbling register that made the hair on Kieran's arm stand up. "But you are mine again. And this time, you aren't leaving." February bled into March, dragging a relentless, freezing rain across the city. Kieran watched it from the 68th floor. The floor-to-ceiling windows in the penthouse living room offered a panoramic view of the skyline, but all Kieran saw was a sheer, unsurvivable drop. He was 34 weeks pregnant. The weight of the twins had shifted downward, settling heavy and hard against his pelvis. Every step was a calculated negotiation with pain. He spent his days wrapped in an oversized charcoal gray cardigan belonging to Declan, pacing the length of the Persian rugs. The wool smelled permanently of frosted pine and ozone. Kieran hated the cardigan. He hated that he couldn't take it off. If he removed it, the anxiety would spike, his chest would tighten, and the twins would begin a frantic, bruising assault against his ribs. His treacherous omega biology demanded the alpha's scent, holding his own body hostage to ensure compliance. He was a ghost haunting a luxury furniture showroom. Harrison, the silent, hulking security guard, stood at the elevator bank. A private chef delivered meals that tasted like cardboard to Kieran's stressed palate. Dr. Evans visited every third day, measuring, prodding, and adjusting the dosage of Kieran's prenatal supplements with the clinical detachment of a mechanic checking tire pressure. Declan was a phantom who only materialized when the sun went down. He would return from the firm, shrug off his suit jacket, and sit in the armchair across from the sofa where Kieran lay barricaded behind pillows. Declan rarely spoke. He just watched. He watched Kieran eat. He watched Kieran breathe. He watched the erratic, rippling movements beneath the fabric of Kieran's clothes as the pups shifted. The silence between them was dense, toxic, and suffocating. On a Tuesday afternoon, while the chef was out sourcing organic produce and Harrison was distracted by a phone call, Kieran slipped down the hallway. He shouldn't be walking. Dr. Evans had prescribed strict bed rest, but the confinement was making his skin crawl. He needed to know what Declan was planning. Alpha CEOs did not do things without a long-term strategy. He reached the heavy walnut door of Declan's home office. It was unlocked. Kieran pushed it open. The room was austere, black leather, dark wood, and the overwhelming, undiluted scent of Declan. It made Kieran's mouth water and his stomach churn simultaneously. He shuffled to the massive desk, his fingers trailing over the polished surface. A leather binder sat open next to a sleek laptop. Kieran looked down. Legal custody and severance agreement, draft V4. Kieran's breath hitched. He braced a hand against the desk, leaning closer to read the dense, justified text. Upon the successful delivery and weaning of the heirs, the Omega Party, Kieran Brooks, relinquishes all primary custodial rights to the Alpha Party, Declan Hayes. The Omega Party will be granted supervised visitation rights, contingent upon residing in a Hayes Holdings approved property. A sharp, high ringing started in Kieran's ears. Financial compensation for the gestational period shall be paid in a lump sum, provided the Omega Party signs a non-disclosure agreement regarding the parentage. They were buying the babies. They were going to pay him off, stick him in a shiny new apartment, and let him visit his own children like a favored aunt. The divorce hadn't been enough. Declan was going to surgically remove him from the family tree. You shouldn't be out of bed. Kieran jumped. A sharp, tearing pain shot across his lower abdomen, so intense his knees buckled. He grabbed the edge of the desk, gasping, white-hot sparks dancing in his peripheral vision. Declan stood in the doorway. He wore a tailored charcoal suit, a briefcase hanging loosely from his grip. His slate eyes dropped to the open binder on the desk, then flicked up to Kieran's pale, sweat-slicked face. He didn't look guilty. He looked annoyed. "Did you read it?" Declan asked, stepping into the room and closing the door behind him with a soft click. "You're going to take them," Kieran whispered. His voice was a thin, ragged thing. He pointed a trembling finger at the paperwork. "You're going to lock me out." "I am securing their future," Declan corrected smoothly. He set his briefcase down. "You are unstable, Kieran. You lived in a slum. You scrubbed floors at 2 a.m. while carrying my children. You demonstrated a catastrophic lack of judgment. I cannot allow that chaos to influence their upbringing." "They're my babies!" Kieran yelled, the sound tearing at his vocal cords. He shoved the leather binder off the desk. It hit the floor with a heavy thud, pages scattering across the rug. "You threw me away! You don't get to just claim them now!" Declan crossed the room in 2 strides. He gripped Kieran's shoulders. his fingers digging into the soft wool of the cardigan. I am an alpha. They carry my name. They will inherit my legacy. You are an unbonded Omega who couldn't even afford his own groceries. What can you offer them, Kieran? Poverty? Spite? Kieran stared up into the cold, impenetrable gray eyes. He searched for a flicker of warmth, a memory of the man who had held him 4 years ago. There was nothing, just a ledger, just a calculation of assets. I can offer them love, Kieran choked out, tears spilling over his lashes, hot and bitter. Something you don't even understand. Declan's expression tightened. For a fraction of a second the mask slipped. A muscle in his jaw jumped, and the heavy scent of ozone turned sour, almost burnt. Love didn't keep them safe, Declan said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. Money did. I did. Another spike of pain ripped through Kieran's stomach. This one didn't fade. It wrapped around his lower back, crushing his spine like a vice. He cried out, his legs giving out completely. Declan caught him before he hit the floor, hauling him up against his chest. Kieran? The clinical detachment shattered. Declan's hands roamed over Kieran's back, feeling the unnatural rock-hard rigidity of the Omega's muscles. Something's wrong, Kieran gasped, burying his face in Declan's lapel. The smell of pine was overwhelming, triggering a violent surge of conflicting instincts. He wanted to push the alpha away. He wanted to claw open the suit jacket and burrow into his chest. It hurts. Declan, it hurts. Declan swept him off his feet. Harrison! The roar tore from Declan's throat, vibrating against Kieran's cheek. It was a terrifying, guttural sound, the pure, unfiltered panic of a cornered alpha. Get Dr. Evans! Now! The medical suite down the hall was a sterile, glaring white nightmare. Kieran lay on the mechanized bed, the paper crinkling beneath his sweat-soaked back. The bright surgical lights overhead bleached the world into a harsh, blinding contrast. The room smelled of iodine, bleach, and fear. 34 weeks, Dr. Evans muttered, his gloved hands moving quickly between Kieran's legs. His water just broke. Fluid is clear, but his blood pressure is astronomical. We can't stop it. The pups are coming. Do something, Declan snarled. He was pacing at the foot of the bed, his suit jacket discarded, his tie ripped off. He looked feral, his chest heaving, his pheromones bleeding out in thick, suffocating waves of distressed pine. I am delivering your children, Mr. Hayes. Dr. Evans snapped back, finally losing his deferential tone. But I need him to dilate further. The stress hormones are causing his cervix to clamp down. He's fighting the process. Kieran couldn't help it. Every time a contraction hit, his body seized in terror. The pain was absolute. It felt like his bones were being pried apart with hot iron. He writhed on the bed, a high, thin scream tearing from his lips as another wave crashed over him. Make it stop! Kieran sobbed, his head thrashing against the pillow. His fingers clawed weakly at the bed rails. He was drowning in pain, disconnected from his own body. Please, Mr. Hayes, the doctor said sharply. He needs you, your scent, your touch. Suppress his panic or we're going to lose the fetal heart rates. Declan stopped pacing. He stared at Kieran, his face pale, a horrifying realization dawning in his eyes. All his money, all his lawyers, all his control meant absolutely nothing in this room. He couldn't draft a contract to stop the bleeding. He couldn't buy his way out of the biology he had exploited. Declan moved to the head of the bed. He leaned over, bracketing Kieran's body with his arms. Kieran, Declan ordered, his voice rough and shaking. Look at me. Kieran squeezed his eyes shut. No, get away. You're going to take them. I'm not. Declan lied. Or maybe it was the truth. Kieran couldn't tell. Declan pressed his face into the crook of Kieran's neck, right over the faded silver scar of their old mating mark. He inhaled deeply, then released a heavy concentrated wave of soothing, purring alpha pheromones. It hit Kieran's system like a narcotic. His panicked gasping slowed. The rigid muscles in his thighs and back surrendered to the chemical command, going slack against his will. It was humiliating. He was yielding to the man who was breaking him just to survive the pain. "That's it," Dr. Evans encouraged, adjusting the monitors. "He's dilating. Kieran, on the next contraction, I need you to bear down." The next hour was a blur of blood, screaming and tearing flesh. Kieran clung to Declan's forearm, his nails digging crescent moon divots into the alpha's skin. Declan didn't flinch. He stayed anchored over Kieran, murmuring low, continuous praise that sounded alien on his tongue. "Good. You're doing exactly what you need to. Breathe for me." "I hate you!" Kieran screamed, bearing down with a primal, agonizing push. The pressure felt like he was being split in half. "I hate you so much!" "I know," Declan rasped back, wiping the sweat from Kieran's forehead with a damp cloth. "Push, Kieran, push." A sudden, sliding release of pressure. A sharp, wet cry pierced the clinical silence of the room. It was tiny, furious, and alive. Kieran collapsed back onto the pillows, his chest heaving, his vision blacking out at the edges. "First pup is a boy," Dr. Evans announced, quickly suctioning the tiny, writhing purple form. "He's small, but his lungs are strong. Nurse, get him to the incubator." "No," Kieran whimpered, reaching out a weak, trembling hand. "Let me see him." "There's another one coming, Kieran," Declan said, pressing Kieran's hand back down to the mattress. His hands were slick with Kieran's sweat. "You have to finish this." The second contraction hit almost immediately. Kieran didn't have the strength to scream. He just bit down on his lower lip until he tasted copper, putting every ounce of remaining energy into a final, devastating push. The second release. A softer, weaker cry. "A girl," Dr. Evans said, his voice tense. "She's struggling. Cord was wrapped. Oxygen now." The flurry of activity in the room spiked. Nurses moved with terrifying speed. Kieran couldn't see past Declan's broad shoulders. He heard the harsh hiss of oxygen, the rapid clicking of monitors. "Is she—" Kieran couldn't finish the sentence. The exhaustion pulled at him like a heavy undertow. Declan turned his head, watching the medical team. The muscles in his jaw locked. He looked back down at Kieran, his slate eyes dark and unreadable. "They are stabilizing her. She's breathing." Kieran let out a ragged sob, the last of his adrenaline fading. He felt hollowed out, empty, and broken. He closed his eyes, the smell of blood and iodine finally overtaking the scent of pine. The darkness rushed in, cold and absolute, and he let it drag him under. Consciousness did not return all at once. It seeped in through the cracks of a heavy narcotic dark, heralded first by the smell of rubbing alcohol and the dull, rhythmic, mechanical hiss of a machine pumping air. Kieran lay perfectly still. His mouth tasted of old copper and dry cotton. The right side of his jaw ached where he had bitten down on the inside of his cheek, but that pain was a distant, insignificant static compared to the ruin of his lower half. Beneath the heavy, down-filled duvet, his pelvis felt as though it had been shattered and haphazardly glued back together. The pull of fresh sutures burned with every shallow breath. But the most terrifying sensation was the emptiness. The heavy, suffocating weight that had pressed against his lungs and spine for 8 months was gone. The internal flurries of movement, the sharp kicks against his ribs, the constant, demanding presence of 2 lives sharing his bloodstream, vanished. The sudden vacancy left a gaping, hollow crater in his center. Panic, sharp and visceral, spiked in his chest. His heart rate monitor on the bedside table immediately began to beep, a frantic, high-pitched warning. He forced his heavy eyelids open. The room was bathed in the low amber glow of a single recessed wall light. He wasn't in the glaring white medical suite anymore. He was back in the massive, opulent main bedroom of the penthouse. He turned his head, the paper-thin skin of his neck catching against the collar of a soft cotton hospital gown. In the far corner, nestled between a heavy oak bookshelf and the floor-to-ceiling window, sat a state-of-the-art neonatal incubator. It was a clear plastic box of wires, tubes, and glowing blue digital readouts. Sitting in a low leather armchair directly beside it was Declan. The Alpha did not look like a titan of industry. The immaculate, tailored facade had completely disintegrated. He wore the same dark slacks from yesterday, but they were crumpled and stained. His dress shirt was missing, replaced by a dark, unbuttoned Henley that clung to his broad shoulders. He leaned forward, his elbows resting heavily on his knees, his face buried in his hands. The scent radiating from him was utterly stripped of its usual sharp, commanding ozone. It was flat, stale, and steeped in a raw, primal exhaustion. He smelled like burnt wood and fear. At the sound of Kieran's accelerated heart monitor, Declan dropped his hands. His head snapped toward the bed. The slate-gray eyes were bloodshot, rimmed with deep bruised shadows. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The air in the room was thick, heavy with the ghosts of the screaming and the blood from the hours prior. Slowly, Declan stood up. His movements were stiff, the joints of a man who had been locked in a rigid posture of terror for an entire night. He walked across the thick Persian rug, the silence stretching until he reached the edge of the mattress. He didn't sit. He loomed, looking down at Kieran with an expression that bordered on a grimace. "The alarms," Kieran rasped. His vocal cords felt shredded. He tried to swallow, but his throat was like sandpaper. They're stable," Declan said. His voice was a harsh, gravelly whisper that barely carried over the hum of the incubator. He reached for a plastic pitcher on the nightstand, poured a small amount of water into a paper cup, and offered it to Kieran. Kieran ignored the cup. "How small?" Declan slowly lowered his hand, setting the cup back down. "The boy is 4 pounds, 2 ounces. The girl is 3.8. They are premature. Their lungs are underdeveloped, but Dr. Evans successfully administered the steroids before they crowned. They are breathing on their own. They don't need the ventilators, just the heated oxygen." Kieran closed his eyes, letting out a long, shuddering exhale. A single tear slipped hot and fast down his temple, burying itself in his hairline. Alive. They were alive. "Can I hold them?" Kieran asked, opening his eyes to look at the Alpha. "Not yet," Declan replied tightly. "The girl's temperature regulation is erratic. She cannot be removed from the thermal environment for another 24 hours. Declan shifted his weight, his large hand gripping the heavy wooden footboard of the bed. The knuckles turned white. "She crashed twice in the night. Her heart rate dropped. The nurses tried to stabilize her. I tried to stabilize her." Declan paused, his jaw clenching so hard a muscle jumped beneath his cheek. The admission seemed to physically pain him. "My pheromones agitated her. The ozone triggered a stress response. She couldn't regulate." Kieran stared at him, watching the fracture in the Alpha's armor widen. A billionaire who could buy whole city blocks, who could command rooms of ruthless executives, had been entirely powerless as his daughter suffocated, rejected by her own sire's scent. "We had to take a swab of your scent gland," Declan continued, his voice dropping into a dark, bitter register. "While you were unconscious, we put the gauze in the incubator. It was the only thing that calmed her down. She wanted her mother." The silence returned, heavier this time. Kieran looked past Declan, toward the clear plastic box in the corner. His babies were in there, tiny, fragile, fighting for every breath. They belonged to the Hayes Empire, but their biology was screaming for the Omega who had starved above a laundromat to keep them safe. Declan reached into his back pocket. He pulled out a folded piece of heavy cream-colored parchment paper. Kieran recognized the weight of it, the texture. It was the same paper they had used for the divorce papers. "I know what that is," Kieran whispered, staring blankly at the ceiling. A cold, heavy resignation settled over his chest, freezing the last of his tears. He was too broken to fight. His body was a ruined shell. "The custody agreement, the severance." He slowly turned his head back to Declan, his eyes deadened. "I'll sign it. I don't care about the money. Just write in a clause. Let me stay in the building. I'll live in the basement with the cleaning staff for all I care. Just let me see them. I won't cause a scene. I won't claim to be your partner. Just let me be near them until they are strong enough. Declan looked down at the folded paper in his hand. He stared at it for a long, agonizing minute. The scent of burnt wood in the room began to shift, the sharp, territorial pine slowly creeping back into the edges of the air. Then, Declan grasped the edges of the heavy parchment. With a sharp, violent motion, he tore it in half. The sound of the thick paper ripping was shockingly loud in the quiet room. Kieran flinched, his brow furrowing in confusion. Declan tore the halves again, reducing the meticulous legal document to ragged quarters. He dropped the pieces into the small metal wastebasket beside the nightstand. They hit the bottom with a quiet rustle. "There is no severance," Declan said, his tone entirely devoid of its usual polished corporate cadence. "What?" "I fired the legal team that drafted it," Declan said. He crossed his arms over his broad chest. "There will be no new drafts. You are not moving to a secondary property. You are not living in a basement. You are the Omega parent of my heirs." Kieran's breath hitched, a sharp tug on his internal stitches making him wince. "You're keeping me here." "You will reside in this penthouse," Declan stated, his slate eyes locking onto Kieran's with a terrifying, unblinking intensity. "You will have unrestricted access to the pups. Your medical, physical, and financial needs will be handled directly through my personal accounts. You will never scrub a floor again. You will want for absolutely nothing." "You're keeping me," Kieran repeated, the reality of the golden cage solidifying around him. "We aren't a family, Declan. This is a hostage situation." "Call it whatever you want," Declan countered smoothly, though the tension vibrating in his frame betrayed him. He leaned down, placing both hands flat on the mattress on either side of Kieran's shoulders. He was close enough that Kieran could see the faint silver threads in his dark hair, could smell the stale coffee masking his exhaustion. "You proved you are stubborn enough to hide my blood in a slum to spite me. I proved I will tear the city down to its foundations to get them back. We are a profound liability to each other." "Then let me go," Kieran breathed, his heart hammering against his ribs. "I can't." The words hung in the air, absolute and irrevocable. It was the most honest thing the Alpha had said in 4 years. The admission was dragged out of him, reluctant and bitter, tasting of defeat. "They need you," Declan whispered, his gaze dropping to Kieran's pale, chapped lips before snapping back up to his eyes. "And I cannot risk them. So you stay." Kieran looked into those cold, gray eyes. He searched for love, for affection, for a spark of the romance that had long ago died in a sterile boardroom. There was none. Declan only knew how to acquire, how to hold, and how to guard his assets. But as Kieran looked closer, past the Alpha's posturing, he saw it. The terror. The profound, paralyzing fear of a man who realized that all the wealth in the world could not force a premature infant's lungs to expand, and could not replicate the scent of a mother's love. Declan was trapped too, bound by his own biological instinct to protect his line, held hostage by the very Omega he had tried to discard. The power dynamic had shifted in the dark. A cold, cynical armor slowly began to encase Kieran's fractured soul. He wasn't the weak, weeping Omega throwing up in an alleyway anymore. He wasn't the discarded husband begging for scraps. He was the anchor to the Hayes legacy. He held the very air those babies needed to breathe. "All right," Kieran said softly. His voice was suddenly steady, stripped of its previous tremor. "I'll stay." Declan's shoulders dropped a fraction of an inch, a microscopic release of tension. "But understand this, Declan," Kieran continued, his tone dropping into a low, hard register that made the Alpha's eyes narrow. "I am not your husband. That marriage ended the day you handed me a pen and watched me walk out into the cold. I am only here as the mother of your children." Kieran shifted slightly on the pillows, ignoring the burn of his stitches. He held the Alpha's gaze, refusing to submit to the heavy pheromones pressing down on him. "This is my room now. You sleep down the hall, and you do not touch me ever again unless I give you permission. Are we clear?" A muscle flickered in Declan's jaw. The possessive territorial instinct of an alpha flared in the gray eyes, a violent surge of pride demanding to conquer the rebellion. But Declan looked at the incubator in the corner, then back at the exhausted, unbreakable Omega on the bed. He had bought his heirs, but he had surrendered his kingdom to do it. Declan gave a single, tight, resentful nod. Understood. He pushed off the bed, straightening his ruined shirt, and walked back to the leather chair. He sat down, turning his back to Kieran, resuming his silent watch over the plastic box. Kieran closed his eyes. The room smelled of ozone, sterile machinery, and the faint, enduring scent of warm honey and bruised chamomile. He had lost his freedom, but he had won the war. The ledger was closed. He was a prisoner in a gilded cage, but as he listened to the steady, dual heartbeat rhythm of the monitors, Kieran knew exactly who held the keys. The ink on the divorce papers was dry, but the bond of blood and survival proved far stronger than any legal contract. Kieran has traded the harsh streets for a gilded cage, but this time, he's the one holding the Alpha's legacy in his hands. Will Declan's cold calculations finally shatter against the reality of fatherhood, or will this bitter arrangement destroy them both? If this raw, emotional journey kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Share this video with your fellow drama lovers to support the channel and brace yourselves, because the war inside the penthouse is just beginning.